Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. My name is Jessie, Barton, Hronesova. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the Queen Elizabeth House in International Development, and it's my great privilege to be chairing today's session. This session is the second seminar in a seminar series that we've organized on Southeast European studies here at CSOX. And it is convened by Othon Anastasakis, David Madden, and myself. And if you do not have the brochures yet, you can pick them up here. We've got some interesting seminars. Next week, we're going to be talking about the Balkan route and migration. Let me introduce today's seminar, which is on a very topical topic. About 4 or 5 years ago, a bit of a frenzy started about research into radicalization and extremism, which obviously has its roots in a lot of other disciplines that we would have been studying before, such as nationalism, identities, and a lot of other ones, including political violence. But it was the events that were happening in the Middle East that started affecting the Western Balkans and Southeastern Europe widely as well. And that's when a lot of attention started to be paid to the phenomenon of radicalization, foreign fighters, and extremism, and especially violent extremism. And I'm very privileged that we have some wonderful speakers that came to us from London and Budapest to speak about this topic. On my left, we've got Florian Qehaja, who's usually based in Kosovo. He's the director of the Kosovo Center for Security Studies. But this year he's in London. He's based in London at the Royal College of Defence Studies, and this is why it has been quite easy for us to get him. So we're really happy to welcome you here, Florian. And I must say that Florian is probably one of the utmost experts on a broad range of security issues regarding especially the Western Balkans, and sometimes also referred to as former Yugoslavia plus Albania. On my right is Asya Metodieva, who was a visiting student here at DPIR last year, I think. She's currently a doctoral candidate at the Central European University, still in Budapest, very shortly moving to Vienna, as we all know. And her research is mainly into recruitment of individuals into radical movements in post-conflict or post-violent societies. Florian will speak first because he will give us probably a wider understanding of the region, and then Asya will speak about the phenomenon of foreign fighters. Florian, over to you. And each of the speakers will have about 15 to 20 minutes, and then obviously we'll have a Q&A.
Thank you, Jessie. It's my great pleasure to be here in Oxford and provide some thoughts on the issue of violent extremism and radicalization in the Western Balkans. As Jessie rightly pointed out, it was much easier for me to come because I'm currently a member of the Royal College of Defence Studies, so I came from Paddington to here, and it's of course an exercise for me, now to come back to my research angle that I've been focused in the last years, unlike RCDS, where we are focusing more on the strategic issues and defence. I was leading a think tank called the Kosovo Center for Security Studies, which is a leading security-related think tank in Kosovo, but also it had a footprint beyond Kosovo, meaning the Western Balkans and especially Albania and North Macedonia. And we have been doing flagship research on the issue of radicalization, not only in Kosovo, but also in the countries that I mentioned. And actually, I remember when we started to deal with the foreign fighters, it was quite tricky, and quite challenging to come up with a topic which was, very new from the research point of view, but also, quite security sensitive, in the sense that there was lots of reluctance to have access to people. We have been also interviewing the returned foreign fighters, we had the, let's say, the privilege of accessing the correctional service and interviewing, so we wanted to see, the drivers directly from them, which are, I will try to explain, quite different from one to another. So if you are more interested on our research, you can just Google and find our Kosovo Center for Security Studies. So speaking generally about violent extremism in the Balkans, we should not forget the fact that the Balkans as such, is in such a geographic position in terms of relevance and importance that it's always at the crossroad between, the West and the East. It's in the periphery of the Western influence, Russian influence, Middle East and Turkish influence. So also when it comes to the foreign fighters, radicalization, refugee crisis that we had, it has its relevance. And of course, when we started to research, we saw that there is an increasing number of foreign fighters from the Balkans that joined terrorist formations such as ISIS, Jabhat al-Nusra, al-Sham lately, and so on. So our estimate was about 1,200 people that in total managed to join these formations. Of course, here we are not talking only about foreign fighters as such, but also family members, which we of course make this clusterization that they don't have this combat readiness. Speaking of this number, now recently we in Kosovo there are 110 family members that were returned. Kosovo is one of the first countries that had this kind of willingness and open door policy in terms of returning the families, and working with them rather than sidelining and leaving them in the camps in Syria or in Turkey. But when we speak about the causes of violent extremism as such, there is a difference on the way how we see causes of radicalization extremism, which is related to Islam or to the misuse of the religion of Islam. And this is by all means only one of the problems of radicalization that we have in the Balkans. We have nationalism as a indigenous or quite long-standing type of radicalization. We have radicalization which is driven by the Orthodox Church as well, but we can talk about that as well. But speaking about radicalization which derives from the ideology of Islam, in Kosovo and in Albania and North Macedonia, the roots of radicalization came after the conflict or after the authoritarian regime in Albania, in the sense that there was a new wave of NGOs that were coming and then investing through different ways and instruments of bringing new ideology which is non-indigenous in terms of practicing Islam. People were traditionally attached to the Hanafi school of thought, which was based in Istanbul, and most importantly, the societies are predominantly secular. So suddenly you had this kind of wave of NGOs that were, using the post-conflict period in terms of widespreading the ideology. For instance, we have found out that immediately after the war, you had the IT equipment that came from different Saudi, organizations, and it was about IT, but that was a cover story. Of course, after that, that was the lessons about Salafi, elements and so on. But the main problem came from the imams that happened to go and study in some Middle East countries, and especially in some school of thoughts. And we have especially depicted the most radical elements of Takfiri ideology, and we have quite broadly discussed about this in our report about the means that they have used. But unlike Bosnia and Herzegovina, when the roots of radicalization came with the foreign fighters that came to fight along the Bosniak elements, we didn't have any element of Mujahideen in the Kosovo Liberation Army, because the very idea of the liberation of Kosovo was based on the national grounds, on the Albanianism. So it did not consider any kind of offer that came on this kind of from the Mujahideen element, and this is important to mention. And of course, this is also the reason why we tend to differentiate the ways and means of radicalization in let's say in the Albanian-speaking countries and in the South Slavic-speaking countries, in the sense that there is more of a lingua franca, in terms of cooperation between the individuals and imams along the language lines, and on the other side you have Bosnia and other South Slavic countries, which the roots of radicalization, as I said, are slightly different, but not, of course, very different from from the rest of the Balkans. As I said, when we deal with radicalization, and we still deal, we found out that we are talking about the minority of people that were subject to certain ideology, that were, let's say, infected by this violent ideology in a very secular country, like which did not basically accept, religious views, like coming from the Middle East. And I'm talking here not only for Kosovo, but also for Albania. And the difference here is that with our certain neighbors, unlike the Albanianism, the Orthodox Church among our certain neighbors is quite influential in the daily life. We can see now, for instance, with the events in Montenegro, in which, of course, there are lots of controversies going on there when it comes to the property of the Orthodox Church. But you can see that even the mainstream intellectuals are aligned along the Orthodox Church, whereas in our side, there is some sort of antagonism towards a religious element in the public life. That's why we try to say that there is a minority of people that have been trying to push the agenda, unlike the majority, which is predominantly secular. In terms of the drivers of radicalization that we have depicted, we have identified some, of course, identity crisis, individual identity crisis of the individuals, like that they were basically asking themselves of what they want to achieve and what they belong to. Then the corruption and state capture, this had a severe influence on the formation of individuals and the ways that they have been, triggered by the offers of radicalization. Global jihadism, did have implications in the sense that people were, trying to opt for protagonism. Then losing of the hope, and of course lack of religious knowledge in a secular society in which was deeply, exploited by people because, you come from a family which is secular, nominally Muslim, and this led to, antagonism between the young people and the family members in the sense that, these people would say, how come that they are now teaching about religion when they didn't teach didn't get the teaching from their parents. At least in Kosovo, we found out that there are about 40% of those that were subject to, that were part of foreign fighters that had some sort of criminal background. So they were, an easy target of the recruiters. In terms of the threats coming from violent extremism, this is something that we really try to make a clear distinction. Western Balkans is not considered as a zone where there is a potential for terrorist activity. At least there is no perception of the high level of threat comparing to the Western Europe, and there are different reasons for that. One of that is that the Western Balkans does not have any kind of major relevance that the Western Europe has, in this regard. The main problem in the Western Balkans is widespread of ideology, which creates some sort of societal disorder, basically, which creates some sort of inner antagonism between the communities, and these kind of individuals have managed to, basically to affect the cohesion that we have. Of course, there were some attempts for terrorist attacks. The only attempt that we can depict is the attempt for attacking the Israeli football team in Albania, which was successfully, located and right on time identified by the intelligence services. And this was only an attempt, but there was basically a plan to use their presence for a potential attack. And of course, the main problems that we have in terms from the classical security perspective was with the diaspora. The three cases of the terrorist attacks in Syria and in Iraq in the 5 years were coming from people that are originally from Kosovo, but also from North Macedonia. And these people are basically they also have the same fate of identity crisis with their fellows in in the Western Europe. They have been much more, subject to ideology infiltration, driven by elements that were present, especially in Western Europe. So these are the three cases, but none of the cases that we have from the foreign fighters, that returned, we could not find any potential for use of violence from them, of course, but we did not disregard the fact that they can lead to some sort of potential terrorist activity. I think the institutions in this regard, unlike major weaknesses in dealing with the real problems that we have, corruption, organized crime, which are of course limited results, when it comes to this, there was a clear unity in terms of countering, these elements, and in terms of immediately enforcing the law which bans our citizens to join terrorist formations with a sentence from 5 years to 20 years. Then the other problem that we have from the security perspective is that there is no proper security cooperation between the countries in the region because of the political antagonism. For instance, there is no cooperation between Kosovo and Serbia in terms of exchange of intelligence. That was the case also with North Macedonia until 2-3 years ago. So this hampers any kind of, let's say, positive development when it comes to countering regionally these efforts. Of course, there were some sort of international-driven conferences, forums, but when it comes to the classical cooperation that we would expect, also in this regard, there was a reluctance to cooperate simply because of the political positioning. And actually, the violent extremism related to Islam was deeply exploited, and I would say even exaggerated by some sort of media circles, in the sense that it was used as a tool or instrument to attack politically, especially Kosovo, having in mind its contested position vis-à-vis Serbia. For instance, we have been doing media monitoring as part of a disinformation campaign of some media. Sputnik, which is a Russian outlet in Belgrade, constantly refers to some sort of Islamic agendas, as they refer in Kosovo, with the aim of attacking the very core element of the Kosovo's existence. So there is also lots of politics, because also when we did the research and we were trying to access the clear number of figures when it comes to the foreign fighters profile and so on, there is resistance from some countries and police forces to share the data. Unlike countries like mine, Kosovo, and Albania, which was more transparent in terms of openly telling the data when it comes to the number, when it comes to the profile of people, and so on and so forth. There are also some other elements that it's important to mention, which relate to the general political development that do have implications in the overall fatigue, hence radicalization, the enlargement fatigue that we have, in the sense that there is no prospect for enlargement, no visa liberalization, at least for Kosovo. This have some sort of unintended consequence in terms of adding the narrative of the recruiters and all of these groups, saying that, you see, the West is not an alternative, but there are other alternatives coming from the East. So the question arises what we do next, or what we have to do next. We have been promoting a lot the prevention element rather than the repression element, and that proved to be quite successful. For instance, when we started to deal with with the foreign fighters 4 or 5 years ago, very few people were aware of the fightings going on. Communities were not prepared to tell in advance their kids and their members about the traps of radicalization, about the offers coming from suspicious individuals. Now, when we compare nowadays with 5 years ago, we see that people are much more prepared, much more informed, and they are basically sending the message in advance to, I'm talking now about the kids, about the potential offers coming from the, and I think the potential for further widespread of extremist ideology, especially when it comes to Islamic extremism, is minimized, and the reason for that is that also because we find a greater element of resilience. We can talk about resilience, for days. But basically, in our case, we found that there is a strong family element, that still people are still related to family, and we saw that family and the mother did have a greater role in terms of minimizing a further widespread of extremism. The strong national identity element, the inheritance of secularism and so on, were some of the factors that led to some sort of resilience that we have found among communities. And one advantage that we see in our societies, comparing to, let's say, societies in the West, is that people know each other. And this makes things much easier in terms of creating the profile of people, in terms of predicting, forecasting any kind of deviation, or let alone potential terrorist activities from these people, because these communities are indigenous. And this is a difference that I would like to make, for instance, with a settlement that we have in Qehaja, which is in border with North Macedonia, or Pluton here, where for instance, we have seen that there are elements and groups that are subject to some sort of radical views, and it's much more difficult to trace the family connections with their with the country where they come from. Overall, there are significant improvements, and I repeat, at least comparing to lots of deficiencies that we have when it comes to internalized corruption and organized crime, which is a completely different topic. But it's important to stress out that these are more important and more challenging issues that we have, rather than radicalization, without trying to minimize the potential radicalization. But in terms of investments, we have seen that there needs to be more of consultation between community and involvement of the especially Islamic community in this respect, and that proved to be very successful. Then repatriation, I think in our case it proves to be a good move. There was a political willingness of bringing their families back, and they are back into the civilian life. Kids are going to the school. Of course, there needs to be some sort of surveillance and monitoring, and of course a reassurance of non-alienation of these individuals from the majority community. So in this regard, the state is lagging capacity, so does other states, of course, because it's a very complex category. But I think in this regard there is that it was a very good move to bring back 110 members rather than leaving them under the fate of nothing, and they were begging for return, and the families were making pressure and so on and so forth. It is very important to refrain from exaggeration and securitization of issue. We have seen that this backfired and alienated the communities. It was very difficult to work with communities and people that are affected, simply because the rhetoric was very strong against them, trying to alienate and stigmatize them. There is one concern when it comes to the international involvement. There is a growing donor-driven agenda when it comes to this topic. It's a fancy topic, and this is also leading to some sort of alienation of communities. There is a real dash of donors, individuals going to these kind of communities, which is eventually backfiring and producing no result, because people are asking for more prospects, for investments, rather than organizing workshops and discussions, which they are exhausted. So they feel basically exploited. We tend to advise our international partners that would be good to repack the investments that you plan to do with the purpose of decreasing the potential for radicalization, because in this way you are just doing more harm than good. And finally, there is a greater need for mobilization of community leaders, of the municipalities, in order to avoid the weaknesses that we had in the past 10-15 years, in the sense that there were individuals coming out of the blue, widespreading ideology from other countries, from other ideologies, and they were doing this unnoticed. I stop here, but I look forward to any question or comment from your side. Thank you.
Thank you, Florian. And I will maybe in the Q&A, I'll ask you to speak more about the ethno-national radicalization tones.
Yes.
Because we wanted to include them as well.
Okay.
So let's return to that in the Q&A. Asya, floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you very much to everyone for coming tonight. This was a wonderful overview, and I will try to build on the arguments that Florian already mentioned about the role of the conflicts in the region, and basically this is the focus of my research. I'm in the final year of my PhD research, and this is a wonderful opportunity to share with you some of the findings that I have from my fieldwork, and to try to explain academically the way how I'm trying to approach the topic. So, foreign fighter mobilization as a continuation of a war, and this is the title of my project, and the idea is to look specifically at societies in Europe with recent history in war. And as you can imagine, my focus empirically is on the Western Balkans. I would like to start with what we know and what we don't know about the topic of foreign fighters. Certainly, we talk about similar or identical recruitment patterns. This is what the research has established so far. What we don't know, however, is that we do have different origin of the communities these people come from. And therefore, the evolution of the local leadership or the meso-level, the mid-level leadership is different. In European countries and European context, researchers have been very much concerned with the growth of the phenomenon in the West. But as Florian mentioned as well, although we know more about foreign fighters who went to Syria from Paris or London, we don't know that much about those who come from societies with recent history of conflict. Yet the history of these radical communities is not the same. And the radical communities and the radical communities and the radical leadership in London or Paris is different from the ones in Belgium or Sweden, for example. So what I'm trying to do in my research is to trace and identify the processes which connect the legacy of war of some foreign fighters' countries of origin with the process of recruitment. And I use the concept of identity as a conceptual tool to unpack this product of long-term strategic efforts of mid-level or meso-level leadership to target specific communities and spread radical norms in the region. So, in this sense, identity is something that has been manipulated, has been shaped through all the years by a local administration, let's say, or the way I call the recruiters in this project is identity producers. And on the other side of the equation, we have identity seekers. And I will come back to these categories a bit later in the presentation. But basically, the focus here is on the mid-level recruiters. I consider them a driving force behind the recruitment of and radicalization. And as you probably know, most research so far has been focused on individual motivations. We are more interested in why people go and fight, why people decided to become foreign fighters. But we certainly know less about those who are behind the curtain and who are the driving force of this process. So, in this sense, I believe that foreign fighters are simply the tip of an iceberg. They are simply the visible part of invisible processes of radicalization and recruitment that have taken place in broader communities through all the years. It's about the formative and the supportive social environment that has provided individuals with ideological, moral, logistical support, encouraged their views and objectives, and therefore provided them with a sense of identity. So, in this way, this radical community has different layers, but what it certainly managed to produce is a consolidated small micro societies embedded in the broader societies of the Western Balkans. And to explore the evolution of this meso-level leadership, I'm trying to use a theory which combines the framing as, let's say, I'm going to refer to the spread of radical messages through the propaganda of the Islamic State, and on the other hand, the discursive opportunity provided by external and contextual factors. So to understand fully why certain frames succeed, one must consider not only the content of these frames. So it's not only about videos spread by the Islamic State online, but it's also about the context and the cultural factors that are in place in certain regions and communities. While the discursive opportunities exist in the broader context, it remains in the hands of a number of factors to perceive and take advantage of these opportunities. And in this sense, I built this model to try to explain what is the role of the conflicts that we do have present in like the Western Balkans experience. And I really appreciated this distinction between the role of the Mujahideen in the Bosnian war and the fact that they weren't that welcome in the conflict in Kosovo. And this is important distinction because in my view, the war was just a condition. The most important thing is basically the post-war period. The moment when we do have identity crisis, we have fragile or absolutely destroyed, let's say, welfare system, poor education, no access to any kind of opportunities for young people. So basically the idea is that this fragility period managed to become a permissive factor for external foreign actors to come to these fragile societies and take advantage of the situation and to spread radical norms. So micro societies, I consider the outcome of war and post-war spread of radical norms, and they have been venue for radicalization in these societies with recent history of conflict. So the emergence of jihadi Salafi cells basically has been largely facilitated by the influx of these Islamic NGOs in the 90s and this meso-level leadership of radical imams who were educated in Middle Eastern institutions was basically in line with these radical norms that took place in post-conflict societies. And they become the administrators or the local administration of this process. In other words, if I have to summarize this argument, the geography of foreign fighter mobilization in the Balkans doesn't follow random distribution. Not everybody who has Facebook went to Syria. It's about basically the trajectory or the pathways of the local recruiters. It's not about like poor villages or not even in every single case about bordering areas. It's about where people who took action to actively basically spread radical norms and radical messages were active and present. So in those places, at least if we take as an example the map of Kosovo, we can see that basically we have these physical clusters of people who decided to go to Syria in small groups or individuals, but they were certainly influenced by or they were present in this radical circles. So this socialization into extremist circles may or may not manifest itself in individuals' decisions to engage with violence. Yet these domestic networks basically become essential to the mobilization of jihadi fighters between 2011 and 2015. And what matters to the appearance of such circles is the availability of local leaders. One distinction I just want to draw your attention to this outcome bubble. It's basically about the active and the passive positive relationship that these people may have with the radical community. As the second part of the presentation is a bit more empirical and it focuses on the case of Bosnia, let's say that we do have these isolated communities in which we certainly have a lot of men who decided to go, but in many cases we also have entire families, women and children who were not necessarily part of the decision-making process to depart to Syria. However, they were exposed, let's say, to some kind of radical narratives. This is why I put them in this category of having passive relationship with the radical community. They did have a relationship, but certainly it was passive. And as the focus is on mid-level leadership, as I mentioned, recruitment follows the trajectory of this local leadership. I would say that basically foreign fighter mobilization is just one of the options. It was among the forms of utilizing the social capital of jihadi Salafi structures embedded in post-violent societies. And of course, these micro-societies and their administration can only have the impact due to the fragile, the conducive environment which facilitated their experience. The availability of these resources, let's call them Islamic charities and NGOs active in war and post-war period, have fueled this effective grassroots leadership. And what is interesting is that if we take the example of the Bosnian War and the Kosovo War, we do have like different timing and different nature of the conflict. Like in one case, it's like religion played more significant role than in the others. So in the Bosnian case, these networks had more resources to grow, and they did have more time to grow. So in the case of Bosnia and the Bosnian foreign fighters, these, let's say, informal structures have been much better developed than compared to the Albanian, Macedonian, and the Kosovo case. And what is interesting is that these local leaders, they managed to create different isolated type of institutional framework in which basically they were informal authority. The people who went to Syria looked after this, let's say, these leaders as like I will like reveal the different functions that they had, but basically for them they were more important than, for example, asking for advice a teacher in school or a parent. So the trust relationship with these local leaders was pretty strong. When I arrived in Bosnia, actually it was first Kosovo, but then I was still in a very serious state of confusion. But later when I went to Bosnia, I tried to make sense of the very confusing reality, because basically the problem with these local leaders is that it's very hard, especially for an outsider, to understand who is doing what. If you talk to a radical imam, he would never say, oh, yes, I recruit people or I incentivize people to fight for jihad and go and participate in a foreign war. A former fighter who returned to Bosnia in 2016, and I had the chance to interview in Bosnia, he told me the guy who was recruiting people, including my brother in my hometown, he just shaved his beard and disappeared. So I was wondering how to classify and where to put in my research people who were actively present in the moment when the recruitment process took place. And today we cannot talk about them anymore in terms of being active recruiters or being part of this administration and this managing process. So the graph that I'm showing here is basically my attempt to make sense of this different type of local leadership. And I identified different, let's say, pathways. The radical community locally is not a community which necessarily seeks to produce terrorists. It's neither strictly hierarchical or homogeneous. It has frequent ideological cleavages among leaders, and one can distinguish between core and periphery in terms of ideological views and in terms of actions that recruiters were ready to basically to participate. The pathways that I really briefly want to mention are, for example, from the radical periphery. We start from this right corner to radical core. It's about people who are ready to act on their radical views. From the radical core, there might be another pathway to the mainstream core, when they either soften strategically their rhetoric or become more explicit in their rhetoric, depending on external security and political factors. We can also have people who move from the mainstream core to the mainstream periphery, which means that they don't take any action. And we do have imams or recruiters or local type of influencers who move from the mainstream periphery to the radical periphery, which means that they harden their rhetoric. So, if you ask me the simple question, who recruited foreign fighters who went to Syria in 2011 to 2015, these are the people who belong to the radical core. These are people who were basically the so-called Takfiri ideologues, people who were expressing their views openly, and they were extremely pro-violence and pro-jihad. And on the other hand, they basically perceived these radical views, and they act with, like, they use different activities in order to recruit people. And just very briefly about the functions of these local recruiters, it wasn't only about preaching. This is like, let's say, findings from the Bosnian case. They were in charge, for example, to issue letters of recommendation. You cannot get to Syria if you don't have like a document or some kind of confirmation from the local leaders in the Bosnian case. They were also performing the so-called practice of ruqya, which is a religious healing. So they were using different types of socialization with their targets in order to build trust, to build community, and to show them that they can rely on them for advice and let's say some kind of feedback. So if we have to summarize, local leaders were in charge for ideological, logistical, and financial support in some cases, building an image of spiritual authority, and of course managing and maintaining influence at the community level. And let me clarify something. This didn't happen in 2019. It didn't come out of the blue with the outbreak of the Syrian war. This has been like a long-term process of building relationship with these targets for, in some cases, for more than 20 years. In the Kosovo, in the Kosovo case and the Albanian communities, let's say these radical groups are younger, let's say younger, and not that well established. A few findings about the profile of these individuals. In the case of Bosnia, in most cases it's about graduates from Islamic universities. They rely on Salafi preachings and teachings. They have sponsorship from outside. They're well connected to diaspora leaders, and they often operate in most cases, although we do have also a couple of cases who operate as part of the Islamic community, but the majority they operate outside. Comparing the two top recruiters of Bosnian foreign fighters, one of them he was recruiting for the Islamic State, the other one for Al-Nusra. They have a lot of similarities. They share. I'm studying basically the biographies of these people, and what I can see is that ideologically they have the same type of radical rhetoric, which became even more radical with the triggering moment when it appeared. They opposed the state and religious institutions. They were actively involved in recruitment, linked to the Saudi Islamic Center in Vienna, and had support from outside in terms of personality, very charismatic, good communication skills, and they were really influential in their communities. And I would like to end with this slide. I think a friend of mine asked me last week, why do you call them mid-level leaders but not local leaders? And I created this graph in order to try to explain this, because basically, you know that the Western Balkans, it's about like a very messy in terms of ethnicity and religion region. When we talk about Albanian fighters, it's not only about Kosovo, but also Macedonia and Albania. When we talk about Bosnian fighters, it's about Serbia, Montenegro, Bosnia. But what I also found interesting is that in the case of Bosnia, we do have very well developed external leadership, which was about a group of imams operating in Vienna. They were basically the mentorship link between Western Europe and the Western Balkans, and they played a unique role of ideologically and logistically providing support to the recruitment process in 2015, 2016. They were actually arrested in 2015. And to conclude here, so far, after conducting about 7 months of field work in the region, in some cases successful, in other cases not that far due to the fatigue and other factors that were mentioned, I can say that in summary, like my 4 key hypotheses so far have been confirmed, and these are concerned with the origin, the structure, the narrative, and the targets of these mid-level leaders. So basically, when it comes to origin, meso-level leadership emerges as a byproduct of war and post-war fragility. If fragility was not present, the influx of Middle Eastern charities and therefore the emergence of local Salafi leaders would have been less incentivized and less possible. When it comes to structure, if targeted activities of meso-level leaders are present, the appearance of radical hubs is more likely. And what can be seen in the Western Balkans is exactly that these physical clusters exist. They basically, the geography of recruitment follows the trajectory of local leadership. When it comes to narratives, if meso-level leadership's history is rooted in conflict and post-conflict environment, it is likely that they translate global Islamic State agenda to local narratives and to local audiences by employing war memories and legacies of local conflicts. And when it comes to targeting, only if targets have had active positive relationship with the local leaders, they were part of the decision-making process to go to Syria. And I'm going to stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you, Florian. Thank you, Asya. That was a really thorough kind of overview from Florian's side, what's happening, and then Asya kind of explaining to us a lot of the mechanisms. Before we move into the Q&A, I'd like to give the floor to Elias Rubais, Rubanis, sorry, from the Tactics Institute, who's gonna say a few words about some latest research that the Tactics Institute has done on this topic.
So it's dated, well, it was delivered November, but it's dated January 2020, but it was November 2019 that was first launched a report. I was the project manager for the report, so we had an original scoping of the question. The report is entitled Social Exclusion and Radicalization in the Balkans, and it looked at Bulgaria, North Macedonia and Bosnia. I will just do this very briefly. I will tell you, so I will only focus on North Macedonia and Bulgaria, just not to go over things that have already been told. So I will refer to work by Brigadier General Metodieva, who has worked in Ankara in the NATO Center of Excellence for Counterterrorism Studies, and also the work of the team of Professor Tatiana Tronsina from Kliment Ohridsky University in Sofia. The unique part of her work is not that it's only based on debriefings of security analysts, but that she actually stayed in a camp under a process of radicalization for periods of times, like a month every time. So it was participatory methods, let's say, for anthropologists in the group. So just long story short, just to add to what I've heard, not repeat anything, it seems that the classic 90s infrastructure is changing rapidly of radicalization. So you do not have the NGO / radical mufti who goes in an area and tries to change the discourse, the indigenous Islam into a more radical Islam, but you have informal networks by people who are settled in a region and have a personal status and a personal appeal to the community. Social exclusion is very relevant precisely as in Western Europe, and that's one point of disagreement, at least from what I've read. It's precisely as in the Emir of Molenbeek, as in the report of the 2015 Dutch police report. The communities targeted are, in British modern terms, somewheres, people very rooted in a specific community with very little global anywhere approach. Like they don't have, they don't speak English, they don't have mobility facilities. And the interesting part about these two studies is that it focused on Roma people, and they are very recent cohorts. They are not historically Muslim. It's the same people that the born-again Christians target. And also they have an opportunistic relationship to conflict. So the Syrian conflict was a key catalyst because it linked them to the gold smuggling business, the car smuggling business that went through Central Europe to the ISIS state. The one thing that you can see continuity is the infrastructure slash funding comes often from the same spiritual centers. So Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Jordan, as a more of an intellectual, providing intellectuals. Jordan, Egypt, United Arab Emirates still. So you have same sources, ideological sources, but not the infrastructure is not this. It's not like a center. It's not an urban thing, but it's communities in which the state de facto seems to fail, like where schools are de facto segregated, and where informal networks can prevail within communities. And that's it. I mean, I'll be happy to participate in the Q&A.